Thank you for joining us on Campus Press today. We have Paul Moon as our guest. Tēnā rawa atu koe, Paul. Great to have you with us. Now today for our episode of Books and Books, I wanted to turn to a book of yours called Augustus Earle, Augustus Earle's New Zealand visit, 1827 to 28. I'm a great fan of the book, actually. I think that it captures a picture of life at that time in New Zealand, which I'm not sure that other people have captured. So, could you tell us what it's about?
Well, I think that the package says what's inside. It's about Earle arriving on the west coast of New Zealand at Hokianga in 1828. He walks along to Paihia, and over the period of a few months he walks, visits various people, and produces a great deal of artworks, and keeps a very thorough journal. And so the book really traces that journey.
Okay, so the thing about Earle is the quality of his paintings. Would you like to talk about the painting on the cover of the book first of all?
Right, well, that painting was produced in an island called Tristan da Cunha, which has the distinction of being the most remote island on Earth. And he was marooned there. He had stopped off with a ship delivering supplies to the 6 residents of the island, and the ship left without taking him. So he spent several months there. He taught at the local Sunday school for the children of these 6 adults, and he delivered a few sermons, wrote, and painted. And a very, very, very rare set of paintings of a place that no one else had ever painted before.
Yeah.
And this is one of the features of his life. At the time of his death, he was the most travelled artist in the world. No artist had been to as many different parts of the world as he had. He was originally the artist for Charles Darwin on the Beagle expedition,
That's right.
But he got sick in South America, and so he had to get off the ship there just before a lot of Darwin's important work was done. So very widely travelled, and there's a very frustrating story about him, because he wrote what would have been a multi-volume book of his travels around the world, illustrated with potentially 1,000 or 2,000 paintings. And I've calculated the book would have been perhaps 10 to 15,000 pages all up in these multiple volumes. So it would have been probably the most important travel book of the 19th century. He died as he was working on it. So the journals we have now, as Visit to Tristan da Cunha in New Zealand, are the only surviving thorough accounts we have of this much bigger volume. He died without having any children. It went to his nephew, his estate went to his nephew, all his paintings and this vast manuscript in several boxes. And in the 1920s, a member of the family decided, well, we need the money, we're going to sell this. They went to an auction house. The auctioneer took out the paintings from these boxes and said we can make some money out of this, but threw away the book. Oh. And so this vast multi-volume book was destroyed, basically, thrown away in the 1920s. And so what we have now is just a fragment of his work.
Okay, so it's such a challenging prospect, because to some extent, I guess what you're doing is filling in the gaps. I mean, what do you do when somebody's book is burnt or lost, or there's a big deletion here, which is incredibly important. I mean, the man was going to places other people had never been to before. Again, even Tristan da Cunha is the most, as you just said, one of the most isolated islands on the planet. So we have an incredible loss here, which I've been very, very interested in your work and the quality of it, Paul, because what you're trying to do is to actually fill that gap, fill that loss. There are certain things about his paintings that I find very, very interesting. I think he's got a very, very good use of light, for example. The one on Tristan da Cunha, for example, you can see there's some kind of light welling up from the sea in the background. And that's what it's like up there, not in Da Cunha necessarily, but in the Pacific or in any in the Atlantic as well, and around the equator, you have that feel. Now then, there's some really excellent compositions too in his work. Tell us a little bit about that. Was he an amateur, or do you think he just stumbled upon a form of composition that suited him, or what?
Well, he was a product of his time, and the composition to some extent reflects that. He, I think, exhibited at the Royal Academy, so
Hmm.
he was no, he was partly self-taught, but did have instruction. Uh, but he also had this urge to travel, and had he stayed in England, had he gone down the conventional career route, he certainly would have become much more well known. But he was very curious about going to different places, and the point about Tristan da Cunha and the use of light is very interesting because light features in a number of his works almost as another character, and the character
Yeah, yeah,
represents melancholy.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
And so he has this sense of, I mean, that particular painting is entitled Solitude.
Yeah,
And this idea of being alone and the sort of sense of melancholy that accompanies it, he uses light to manipulate that
yeah,
sensation for the
yeah.
viewer. And he does it very effectively. There's a series of paintings he did in Australia in caves. And there's just people walking through caves with torches or candles. And
Oh, yeah,
again, he uses the light to
yeah,
have that sense of confinement. And
yeah.
normally, light illuminates, of course, but the way Earle uses it has the opposite effect. It shows confinement and
Yeah.
loss and so on.
I mean, it's an interesting thing about New Zealand, the man alone thing, which of course Malgan picked up, and to some extent, I've always thought that's some kind of a reflection of a European idea, in the sense that you have Robinson Crusoe, and you have this idea of someone being almost diametrically opposed, or an alt universe, a completely different place to the crowds of Europe, and being placed in this position where you are the only viewer, so to speak, or you are the only person contemplating things. And I think that contemplation thing is very interesting, that people put into an individual position, then contemplating, which is what he's doing in those paintings, is very, very clear to me. As you say, there might be an aspect of melancholy, or whatever in it, but the fact is that he's in very serious, in some cases, sad reflection. Now,
Very
is
much so.
is that is that a response to the European situation, or is that something that he found, just like Morgan found with Man Alone and so forth, here or in the Antipodes, and in these places so far away? You mentioned Dakuna being Tristan da Cunha being the farthest place on the planet, and that was very much the idea of New Zealand as well. At a certain point, that it was as far as you could go.
Yeah. And there's an element of that. I mean, the question, I suppose, is alone from what? And you're
Yeah.
alone from the hustle and bustle of a busy European city, presumably.
Yep.
And being in a completely different environment does force people to see things in a certain way. And you can see with Earle when he's isolated, even when he's around a few other people, but travelling, he has this sense that he's a witness to something that's very different to that which he's familiar.
Yeah.
And so he tries to document it in art. And he does have that sense that this is me versus the world.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, we'll conclude here because we're coming back to talk about Earle. Just in closing, Paul, how was he treated in New Zealand?
Um, he seemed to be treated reasonably well by some people, not by the missionaries. Now, there's
Yeah.
a subtext to all this, which is that he was quite possibly gay. He mentions this character, Shand, who travelled with him to many parts of the world, but he even paints him in a painting of Hongi Hika. There's an image of Shand and Earle in that portrait. But surprisingly, for someone with whom he travelled so closely for so long to so many parts of the world, he never really talks about him at all. And he does mention, though, the missionaries looked on him with moral disapproval. And I mean, prostitution, for example, was rife in the Bay of Islands at the time, so I don't think he would have stood out for that. So it's quite possible, because he was gay, that the missionaries therefore treated him fairly coolly, and he gives a couple of accounts of how they did that.
Okay, let's close there because we're coming back to talk about something very controversial in our next Books and Books, which is to do with his uh, painting, or was it really his painting? Do we have a question of forgery? We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Thank you very much, Paul Moon. Absolutely excellent to talk to you today. Thank you. Paul, Paul Moon talking to us today.
Thank you, Paul.